My name is Bob Willey. I have the privilege of being the president of the Friends of the Georgetown Library. I was just re-elected being, there was nobody else running for another 2-year term, so you're stuck with me for another 2 years. But anyway, we're so glad you're here with us for our monthly Tuesdays with lecture. Our title comes from a book that came out in 1997, Tuesdays with Maury, and in reference to what was a wonderful relationship between a teacher and a student that went far beyond the college years into the adult years, which is what we're representing here in our lecture series to continuing education for all ages. And this has been a wonderful experience that we've had now as we're into the end of our second year of lectures. We'll talk a little bit more about what's coming up in the future and our plans for the future as well afterwards. But we're so glad today to have Tuesdays with Gary Forrester. Not quite Maury, but anyway, so glad to have him here with us. Gary is the Senior Area Horticultural Agent. I have to read this one, this is so long. How do you do this on a business card? Master Gardener Coordinator, turf grass specialist for the Area Georgetown County's Cooperative Extension, including here as well as up in Conway. Gary has his bachelor's degree and his master's degree from Texas A&M, and in agronomy, turf grass management, and plant biochemistry. His responsibilities include commercial and residential turf grass management and education, commercial and residential ornamental management and education. This is the one I like. Vegetable production, urban tree care and education, Area Georgetown, Marion County Master Gardener Coordinator, and educational programming and natural resources management. He has 35 years of experience in the green industry, 10 years as a golf course builder, superintendent, 20 years as a horticulturalist with Clemson Extension Service, and 17 years as Master Gardener Coordinator with over 600 local citizen certified as South Carolina Master Gardener. If you add that up, he's 103 years old. Is that about right?
Well, that's actually old. That was an extension now for 30 years.
Oh my, I have 12. He's 117.
Add 10 years to all that.
And contributing author or reviewer in several extension publications. We're really glad to have Gary Forrester with us today. Join me in welcoming him.
Yeah, I've been around for a while.
Look pretty good though.
Yeah, sometimes looks is too easy to see me. As he said, I'm Gary Forrester. I'm the extension horticulturalist, cover all this area. Turf grass wise, we kind of cover the whole state now. But I've been here 30 years, and as Amy knows, retirement for the state's 28 years. So I'll let you do the math. I'm probably going to go out sometime next year and be my swan song. So if you need something, get it quick. This is going to cost you to do that. I'm not going to be cheap. If you need to get a hold of us, we don't try to hide. We do have 2 offices. We have one here in Georgetown, which is at the corner of Prince and Broad Street. Everybody know where that is? We're at the old Rice Patty Restaurant. It's at the opposite end of the corner, little blue house, got Clemson stuff all over. You can't miss it. And my main office is in Conway. And that you can go online and get the numbers from there, from our staff pages. That's the better number to call, because I'm only down here 1 day a week, maybe 2. And I don't have voicemail down here. My voicemail is in Conway, so that's really the best number to call to get to me. And I'll just go ahead and give it to you, get away right now. It's 843-234-7713. That is to my office. Summertime it's hard to catch me in the office because I'm out looking at dead plants most of the summer, dead grass, dead something. And I do cover, basically if it grows, I deal with it. Up to a point with vegetable production or agriculture, true agriculture. Once tractor becomes involved, then we have a row crop agent that does that. I deal more with our hobby gardeners than with true row crop agriculture. Yes?
Can you just give that number again?
843-234-7713.
thank you.
That's
Sorry
a
to
direct line into my office.
Okay.
Now, as I go through this, I know you got a question and answer after, but I just assume not wait till the end. If you have something that you got a question, just pop up. You know, I get to listen to myself talk every day, and to be quite honest, I'm not all that impressed with me. So I kind of like to, you know, we're just here chatting about various aspects of gardening, and I want to make sure I answer your questions. Thank you.
I have a holly tree. Well, it just volunteered and came up in front of my porch, and it has been there about 15 years, and no berries come on it. What can I?
You know why?
Is it a male?
You got, within the holly family, it's considered a dioecious plant. You have a male plant and you have a female plant. And only the female is going to put on berries. So you got a little boy, or a big boy. You got a boy, so he's not going to put on berries.
So he never, I say he. So.
But you never say never, but. Any guys in here want to have a baby anytime?
No.
What would you suggest that I do to it then? Because it's just there. But I was hoping that it would have berries.
Plant another one, and make sure it's got berries on it when you buy it. That way you got a female, and they'll live happily ever after, hopefully. If you see one gone the next day, then you'll know they didn't.
Yeah.
They didn't get along with the well. Yeah.
Going around local places, Walmart and Tractor Supply, they're all selling fruit-bearing trees, but none of them seem to know what's the male and what's the female. And with the fruit-bearing trees, don't you need both?
Depends on what particular fruit you got. There are some that need a pollinator, and there's some that don't.
Okay. What grows well in this climate? Could we
Well,
plant
when
like
it
a
comes to fruit trees, unless you're really willing to do an intense pest management, a spray program, we discourage homeowners from planting fruit trees. Now, I say that depending. Now, things like figs will do fine. Pears will do fine. But you get into the apples, and there's certain varieties that would do well here, and there's certain varieties that won't. Now, if you're interested in any kind of citrus, there is a gentleman in Kingstree. His name is Stan McKenzie. McKenzie Farms in Kingstree. He's been growing various kinds of citrus, like the satsumas and those types. You know, the navel oranges and the ruby red grapefruits and things like that. They will not grow here, it just gets too cold in the winter. They can't handle freezing temperatures. But he's real knowledgeable about what particular varieties of citrus will do fine here. Apples, you know, some of the green apples will do fine, but we just don't have the climate for, you know, your red delicious and some of your other apples. You just really have to kind of do your research on what you want to grow. There are several nurseries in Georgia. There's one called Isis, I-S-O-N, and there's one called Ty-Ty, T-Y-T-Y, that grows a lot of fruit-bearing plants. And, you know, if it'll grow in Georgia, it'll probably do fine here. So you might just do some research. And if you got one thing in particular that you're not sure, you can always just call me and we can kind of hash it out.
Oh, it's funny you said figs and pears. That's two of the ones I wanted to put in.
Yeah, figs will do fine.
My other question is like lemons or limes.
But most people plant Meyer, and they'll do fine too. All right, well, let me go ahead and get, yes, ma'am, Ms. Ann.
Another question. Is it wise to put sawdust into your soil to make it soft?
No, it is not. You want to be real careful putting any kind of undecomposed organic matter into the soil, something like sawdust. The microbes that are in the soil that are breaking stuff down, they need nitrogen to function. And if you put a lot of sawdust down in there, then they're going to want to try to break all that stuff down, and they're going to suck all the nutrients away from your plants. So you don't want to put anything into the soil that has not been well decomposed, a good black organic compost type stuff. Now on top, you can put about anything you want. If you're going to mix it within the soil, it needs to be well decomposed. All right, we got to run through this. Maybe it'll spring forth some other questions. And of course, tomorrow is first day of spring, gentlemen. I just found that driving down here. I didn't realize tomorrow's first day of spring. Time is flying by. When you're buying plants, and again, this goes with citrus and anything else, we are considered zone 8. This has changed. I need to put in this particular presentation, I don't have it, but this has changed. Back in the old days, 7 used to start in the Midlands and go to the coast, but right now the entire state of South Carolina is zone 8, or above, down here. Zone 9 now starts, I think, just south of the Santee River. So it's zone 9 is slowly creeping up when we will get here. I don't know. There is a little bit of 7 up in the mountains right here. But we are in zone 8, horticulturally speaking. Now, some things that you want to consider if you're going to be redoing a garden, if you're going to be replanting certain plants, there's some environmental considerations that you need to take into account before you put a particular plant in the ground. And one thing we always teach is make sure you put the right plant in the right spot. And that's going to include the microclimate where, you know, we're in zone 8, right? But you may have certain spots in your yard that may be mimicking zone 10. You know, on the southwest side of the house where it gets full sun in the afternoon, it may get hotter than what a normal zone 8 does. So you need to look at the microclimate where that plant is going to be planted before you select a plant. Sunlight, again, is important. Exposure to wind. We're going to kind of go through some of these individually and break them down. Exposure to salt, although salt here is not a big problem. I grew up on the Gulf Coast of Texas. If anybody has ever been to Texas, you know, things rust really quick. You leave a car out in 2 weeks, it's got rust all over. The air down there, the ocean water down there is a lot saltier than what we have up here. Here we just don't really have that much of a problem with salt coming from the ocean. The biggest salt problem we have is coming out of wells. So if you are irrigating out of a well, you want to be real careful that you haven't stuck your tube into a salty aquifer. The soil characteristics, of course, are extremely important. We're not going to worry too much about underground problems and man-made components. Now, again, you want to be real careful with the microclimate around where that particular plant is going to be placed. In our areas, the north side of the landscape is going to be the coldest in the winter. And the southwest or the south is going to be the warmest in the summer. So you want to make sure that you put plants where they're going to be able to withstand those particular sites. And again, tree canopies can cause some problems, and I've already had some questions about growing grass under trees, and we can address that a little later. Now, as far as sunlight, everybody has read those little tags, and it says full sun, part shade, shade plant. The way that really breaks out sun-wise, and we're talking about direct sun, I'm not talking about filtered sun, I'm talking about direct sunlight on a plant. If it requires full sun, it really needs a minimum of 6 hours, preferably 8 plus. Those that are adapted to full sun, part shade will usually do well with somewhere around 3 to 4. 3 to 4 minimum. More is better. And those shade-loving plants will generally do well in about 2 hours of full sun. And can sometimes be washed out with too much sun. Hostas, you know your hostas? You know, you get hostas out in too much sun, they're going to bleach out on you. Those are true shade-loving plants. Aspidistra, or the cast iron plant, is another one. There are some true shade-loving plants. So, as you're doing some research about plants that you want to bring into the landscape, you need to kind of do some observations first and find out just how much sunlight you have that's hitting that particular spot where you're going to put that plant. Wind. We can't have some wind problems here. Especially if you have some large buildings close together, that wind will funnel through between those buildings. And there are some plants that are more affected by that, something such as a hydrangea. You know, if you have 2 buildings and the wind constantly blows through there and you put a hydrangea in there, it's gonna dry out quicker. So you wanna think about that as well before you put in a particular plant in a particular spot. And then you're running into soil problems as we've already answered the question. If you have clay soils, you know, when they're wet, they're really wet. And then this time of year, we have not had a whole lot of rain this year, you know, compared to what we've had in the past. People seem to forget real quick. They think, well, we had 70 inches of rain last year, we should be good for a couple. No, it's getting pretty dry. So those clay soils, when it's really wet, you know, like we had in the fall, when you're getting 30 inches of rain in 2 weeks, they just sloppy wet. And then when it starts drying out, they get hard as a rock, you can't get water down into them. So in those situations, you either got to amend that soil, or you got to put a plant in that can handle those real wet conditions as well as extremely dry conditions. Because right now you can't get water into a lot of these soils. It rains hard, it's just going to wash right off because they're like a brick. Again, salt is not that much of a problem from the ocean, even if you live real close to it. Now, when you do get a hurricane, you will see some salt burn on some of the trees close to the ocean. But as a general rule, excluding hurricanes, with just general wind patterns, we don't have that much of a problem with salt coming out of the ocean. Again, our biggest salt problem are coming from salt-infested wells. And with salt, you're going to kind of see a browning of the tips. Sometimes you will see this in house plants, especially in the spring if you've been fertilizing them all winter and haven't been flushing out those salts, because all fertilizers have a salt index. You might see some white crusting on top of the soil. You might see some browning of the tips. That very easily could be a salt problem that's affecting the root system. I always want to make sure if you're going to plant big plants, don't plant them under power lines. Because your local electrical company will prune them for you, and they generally do not follow proper pruning techniques. So make sure if you have overhead power lines anywhere around your property, you don't plant a tree that's going to get up into that. Now, if you're putting plants in, if you're rejuvenating plants along the foundation of a structure, you need to be aware that if you have a gutter system, when it rains, that water's not falling off that roof onto those plants. It's going down the gutter, going out the downspout. So those plants can be subjected to droughty conditions because they're not catching the rainfall. Even though it's raining, that rainfall is not hitting those plants. So you need to go out and again do some observations and just make sure if it's raining that those plants are getting some of that rainwater. If not, you're going to have to add some supplemental irrigation. Because I have seen foundation plants that are showing signs of water stress even though we're catching rain. And it's simply because of that. The water is running off and it's not getting to where it needs to be with those plants. Again, one of the most important things that you need to consider if you're going to put a plant in a particular spot, know the mature height and the mature width of that plant. And put it where it can grow to its natural height and width. If you have windows or something in front of the house and you want a plant to stay 4 feet, don't plant one that's going to get 12 foot tall. Because then what do we have to do? We have to constantly prune it back. So again, you need to do research on the size of that plant and make sure that it's put in a spot where it can grow to its natural height. Now, some of the things with soil that we want to consider, one is the pH. And again, we always recommend soil testing. We do that through Clemson. What we need is a height of soil, depending on what you're going to sample. If you're going to sample a lawn, you'll go into that lawn in about 10 random spots, go down 2 or 3 inches, pull out a little plug of soil and mix all those together. Out of that mixture, we need a pint. And you run it down to the office down here, or you go to Conway, whichever one. And it costs $6, which now it costs $6 next year. And you'll get your report back, and we can, and I probably shouldn't do that, 'cause I don't think I turned my phone off either.
Turn off your phones.
Turn off your phone. Mine's liable to ring too any minute. And we'll send it off to Clemson, and again, if you have any questions with it, you can call us and we can go over it. Drainage. I don't see any of my master gardeners. And when I teach a master gardener class, there are 3 things that I want master gardeners to know when they leave my class. And that's drainage, drainage, drainage. If you got good drainage, you can pretty much grow anything. If you don't have good drainage, you're gonna have a hard time. Even plastic plants don't like it. You've gotta have good drainage. With plants, turf is a little bit different, but with plants, you need about 2 feet of a well-drained soil. One thing you need to be aware of is what we call a stratified soil. And that is where you have different textures in soil. You have a sandy soil, you have clay soil, you have a loam soil. Those are textures. When you have 2 differing textures stacked on top of each other, let's say we have clay, and we put a couple inches of sand, the water will go through that sand, but it will not go into that clay until that sand is totally saturated. So adding a couple inches of sand on top of clay is not going to do you any good. Again, you need about 2 feet of a well-drained, homogeneous soil with no layering. How do we get that? Well, there's several ways. One, you can mix compost into that clay. You don't want to mix sand into the clay. You mix sand and clay, and what do you get? Bricks. So they used to make bricks. So you really don't want to mix sand in there. You want to mix some kind of compost. If it's such a heavy soil that doesn't drain well, even adding compost is not going to help. There, you're either coming up on a raised bed. And I've had people bring beds up, that high to try to get plants going. I get the call all the time from people who have moved here from other areas. And they said, people really are proud about their plants down here because they put them up on these big mounds. And now they do that so they will live. Just remember, 2 feet of a well-drained soil is what you really need. That gives you enough buffer down there, because you probably get clay down there 2 feet anyway. That gives you enough of a buffer down there where if it rains, it can have time to soak through before it becomes saturated.
2 questions.
Yeah.
Is there a cost for the soil testing?
$6.
Cheap, okay. Second question, is that the same for lawns as it is plants?
The
The
soil
2
test?
feet?
Yeah, no. With lawns, you can probably get by with a foot, maybe 12 inches. But if you have, if it's sitting right on that heavy clay and it just stays wet, you're gonna have problems. Again, salinity is not much of a problem here unless you have a salty well. Depth of the water table, some areas of the water table that's surface. So, it can be really high. Again, you don't want to layer those soils, and of course you always want to watch out for underground utilities if you're going to be digging, and they do have a way. They will come out and look for it. All right, now, if we're going to plant a plant, whether it's transplanting or putting in a new plant, we're going to kind of go through the steps of doing that. Of course, you always want to choose healthy plants. You go to a nursery, got nice leaves, doesn't have any insects, doesn't have any disease. It's grown in the nursery, it's not dug out in the woods by somebody and brought in. And most nurseries with good reputations around here will do that. So, make sure you just get a good, healthy plant. When you're handling it, always carry it by the pot or carry it by the root ball. And, watch these shows on TV where the guy just starts swinging plants around. That's not good for plants. Just hold them by the root ball so you don't crush it if you drop it. Transporting, everybody's seen the trees in the back of the truck that's just getting beat up. That's not good for plants. Most of us as homeowners, we're bringing back 1 or 2 small plants, so we're keeping them in the car. It's not that big of a deal. I was on 544, there's a yard store, one of those places, and there was a guy with a semi-truck that had about 15 palm trees, and he made a turn and all the palm trees just rolled off the truck onto the road. I'm not sure if I ever want to buy one of those palm trees unless it was discounted. So make sure you handle it properly and you transport it properly. Now, as far as putting that plant into the ground, this has kind of changed for us old-timers. If you remember they used to say put the $5 plant in the $500 hole, dig a really deep, really big hole. Well, that's kind of changed. Now you want to dig a nice wide hole, 3 to 5. In clay soil, 3 to 5 times the diameter of whatever that root ball is. Sandy soils, you don't need to go quite that wide, but no deeper than what that root ball is. One of the downfalls of many plants is planting too deep. Yes,
What about turning the soil underneath it?
I'm good there, hang on. Finish this thought and then see if I answer your question. One of the biggest problems that I see with plants are planted too deep. Whenever you're going to plant a plant, whether it's a shrub or whether it's a tree, you want to take it out of the container and you want to pull the dirt off the top and look for the first root flare, where it kind of starts flaring out at the bottom. That needs to be sitting at ground level. All right? Now, to get back to your question, if you dig a deep hole and you loosen that soil up underneath, if that plant is somewhat heavy, let's say it's a 25-gallon tree, what's going to happen to that soil underneath? It's going to settle and that plant's going to slowly sink. 90% of a plant's roots are probably in the top 6 to 8 inches of the soil. Roots need air to grow. Without air, roots will not grow. Roots do not grow, guess what happens to the top? It doesn't grow either. So if you got a plant that's been planted 5 years in the ground and it's still that tall, more than likely it's planted too deep. And I see a lot of that around here. Make sense? So that hole needs to be no deeper than what that root ball is. Or, you know, if you want to loosen it up, you might plant it up a little bit higher so it'll settle back down. But how much it's going to settle, you know, you get it.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you were saying it needs air, maybe have.
And that's why you want to dig it nice and wide. Even if it's the clay soil, you're busting up that clay and creating little crevices where those roots can grow out. You can tell a plant's been planted too deep because all the roots are up high around the trunk. If you looked at a plant that's planted too deep, those roots are coming up looking for air and water and nutrients. Yes, ma'am?
So if you plant a tree,
Huh?
and then you put in that beautiful mulch around in your garden,
Uh-huh.
so you should not put it around the actual trunk of the tree?
The mulch?
Yeah.
Yes. We do not like volcano. Everybody seen volcano mulching? You know, there's a shopping center outside of Conway. I've got a picture of this. I stood next to that tree and that mulch was up almost
Oh my
to
gosh.
right here. That's how high on that tree that mulch was. And what that does is keep that trunk wet. And you're gonna end up with disease problems and insect problems. So you don't wanna put that, you wanna leave about, 6, 8 inch gap between that trunk and the mulch itself. Thank you. Now, if you got shrubs and you're gonna do a whole bed, you're better off amending that entire bed with a well decomposed organic material. Yeah.
You know, we have an old oak tree that people that had the house before us they had blocks of concrete that were waste concrete, they made a wall out of it. But the one side, because where our driveway used to be, that wall goes right up against the tree and, it's almost like it's dirt and concrete against the one side of the tree. Should we move that out a little bit or because I'm wondering if that's holding moisture and possibly allow place for
It
bugs to
could
get
be.
in.
It could be.
The tree's healthy, it's just,
But that tree has probably gotten bigger over time too.
yeah.
And it's probably gonna keep getting bigger, so yeah, I probably would get rid of that.
Okay.
Anything else on planting plants? And of course, you want to try to avoid planting when the soil is really wet. Now, to get back to the drainage, it's an easy test to determine whether you have a drainage problem. And that's dig a hole, 1.5 feet deep. Fill it with water. Time how long it takes the water to drain out. If it drains out in 3 or 4 hours, half a day, you're good. If you come back a week later and there's still water in that hole, move. Go away, run. And of course, if you start digging a hole, the water starts filling into the hole. Move.
So when you're putting a bush or a tree and you dig this hole and you take out the native soil, when you put the new bush or tree in, you just put the native soil or should, because we just bought a wax myrtle from a local nursery.
Okay.
They said use cow manure, I guess, in the hole and mix it up with the native dirt. So how do you handle that?
Amending, everybody have a question? Amending the soil. So we dig a hole, we take out the native soil, we put a tree in the ground. Now we've got to come back and backfill. If that soil is fairly sandy, I would probably, you said cow manure, you're probably looking at a cow manure compost. You don't want to just go right behind a cow. Aged manure or compost. If it's fairly sandy or kind of loamy, adding about 30 to 50% compost into that backfill will help. Now, if it is a fairly heavy clay soil, I would probably just put the native soil back in, because adding an amendment might cause it to hold that much more water. Now, we're talking about real heavy clay stuff. At that point, you're probably coming up on a raised bed anyway, so.
But for around here, it's mostly more sand-like.
Oh, I know. Everybody have sand around here?
We do.
If you got sand, you know,
Well,
if you live
it's
there,
more
you do it,
sand-like,
probably.
it'll drain in 20 minutes.
Yeah, and there, adding that compost would probably be
So 30
beneficial.
to 50%.
Yeah. Anything else on the planting hole? Or putting in plant?
And it is, sorry, is that, well, this cow manure compost, is that the best thing to use, or there are?
Any kind of compost, whatever kind of compost you want to put. Whether it's, Georgetown doesn't do anymore, Conway still does. The Area County Solid Waste sells compost when they pick up yard debris, they compost and sell it back. But anything bagged, mushroom compost, garden compost, it's gotta have compost. And then I would not use that garden soil, I would use that compost. Yes, ma'am?
When you make your own
Uh-huh.
compost, mine tends to be really wet,
Uh-huh.
so don't add the sawdust. If I allow it to break down,
Don't add the sawdust to
to
what?
dry it,
You can add the sawdust to the compost pile
right,
and let it compost.
right, okay,
But I would not put sawdust right into the ground.
right, okay.
It needs to go in the compost pile, 6 months later.
Should you add nitrogen to it if you're doing something like that?
Nitrogen to what?
To the compost if you're adding,
A lot of undecomposed
Yeah.
organic material. It may not hurt, I wouldn't add a whole lot. Handful maybe of ammonium nitrate or ammonium sulfate. You don't want to have a whole lot because then it'll turn sour. You got ammonium sulfate. Or you can just add green material. And just get, if you continue adding green material in that compost pile, just give it nitrogen.
Gathered up all the leaves and piled it up somewhere else in a sort of forest of live oaks.
Uh-huh.
Am I depleting the soil by taking those leaves off of it?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
if so, what can I do?
Don't do that. Or add fertilizer, it's amazing, especially under large trees, you try to get grass to grow. But, if you look out in Mother Nature, all the leaves fall, they decompose, they enrich the soil, naturally. And we get into the landscape, what do? We blow them all off into a pile, then we compost it and turn it back in. If you have the ability to just to leave underneath the tree, just let those leaves fall naturally and decompose naturally, just do that. They will eventually break down, it's just as they do out in Mother Nature. Yes?
There's so many leaves and it just covers my lawn completely.
Now, the lawn is different. We're talking about underneath large trees.
Oh, okay.
Now, the lawn, most lawnmowers now are mulching type mowers, so you can just mulch those in if you want. Or if you want to bag them and compost them, you can do that as well. But, if you have a mulching mower, it will chop those up. Eventually, they will decompose.
a lot of these trees are the leaves are very acidic, so what can you do to counteract it?
If it's changing the pH of the soil that much, you can add lime. But the acidity coming out of leaves is not going to change the pH that much. I mean, if that were the case, all the soils around here would be 2 or 3 pH. We have a lot of soils that are, 6s to 8s. Soil has the ability to kind of buffer itself to where plants will grow. And if it didn't, there wouldn't be plants growing anymore. Any more questions? Yes, sir.
So just building on the nitrogen question, so if you plant your bush or tree, should you then put some type of fertilizer, like malagonite or something like that on top, or periodically do that?
As far as fertilizing shrubs, if you wanted to, you don't want to put fertilizer into the hole when you plant, before you plant the plant.
Right.
If you want to mix in some bone meal or some blood meal or something like that with the backfill, you can do that. For This is a general rule, for fertilizing shrubs. The rule is 2 tablespoons of fertilizer per foot height of growth. So if you got a 4-foot plant, we're looking at 8 tablespoons.
And would you do that?
And I want
right
everybody to
after-
look up here real quick first. That is not a tablespoon. It does not, and you want to use a good shrub fertilizer, an Osmocote, a Vigoro, something that's got a lot of slow release nitrogen. It doesn't take a whole lot of fertilizer because the plant's going to be picking it up naturally from other places. And if you have just planted one, you really just need to put it right there around the root ball. Because you don't have roots way out here, so you need to put fertilizer out there. It may take 6 months to a year before those roots get out any distance, so you just kind of fertilize around there. And if you want to use the Miracle Grow to Peters, there's no problem with that.
Is it a good idea to fertilize right after you plant it?
Usually it's going to come from a nursery well fertilized. Because if you look at the pot itself, you're going to see the little fertilizer all in there. So it's usually going to have fertilizer coming from the nursery because they fertilize them a little more excessively than what you would out in Mother Nature. As far as timing with shrubs, on real sandy soils, I would probably say 3 times a year. Spring, which I say spring, I would say mid-April. I had a hard frost in my house this morning, and ice in my windshield. So. And that's not to say we don't have another real hard freeze before it's all over with. Then I do it again midsummer. And then I do it again probably end of August, maybe 1st of September. Clay soils, maybe twice a year. Once in the spring and then once towards the end of summer. And of course, if you see nutrition deficiencies, we can kind of go from
And
there.
it's always that 2 tablespoons per foot of growth, and just mix it in with the soil,
Or just kind of spread it underneath the plant, up underneath the canopy of the plant. So another question on here.
That formula, 2 tablespoons of fertilizer for per foot of growth?
Per 1 foot of growth.
growth of the shrubs.
So depending on how many feet it is multiply that times 2. One of the big problems I see, because all fertilizers have a salt index. And if you pile that fertilizer right up next to the trunk, it's going to burn those roots. So you want it spread out. Yes, sir.
Quick question, since you're talking portions of stuff. I bought some weed control that supposedly kills pretty much everything, but it's 2 ounces per gallon when you're spraying it. And it seems to be killing the chickweed, but these dollar weed and stuff, it's doing nothing to. They look greener like I've watered them and given them nutrients.
We'll get to that in a minute. Let's hold off on the turf questions until I get to the turf. Any other questions on planting and planting? I hope you got to about 12 o'clock.
11-ish.
11-ish.
We got a boogie woogie.
What do you think about mill organite?
Mill organite's fine. You know what anybody know what mill organite is? You'll see it at the store. It kind of comes in a green and white bag. It stands for Milwaukee Organic Nitrogen. Milwaukee takes their sewage sludge and makes it into a fertilizer. There's nothing wrong with it. There's not a whole lot in there. It takes quite a bit to do anything. But when I was running golf courses, I used to buy it by the train car load and use it.
Other than my dog licks it up.
Now, one thing it will do, in some cases, it'll keep deer away.
Oh,
If you have a deer problem, because it has that kind of human smell to it, so if you got disease of deer, you can put some mill organite around it, that will keep the deer away.
So if you say melogonite doesn't have much in it, is it more than 2 tablespoons per?
Yeah, that's gonna be a little bit more. This is a 4-2-1, there's only 4% nitrogen in there. So I would probably, you're probably looking at a cup, but it's an organic, so it's not gonna burn anything. Other organics, you have, the holly tones. Remember the holly tones? The holly, that's chicken manure. So, there's all kind of organic stuff out there if you want to go that route too. But it's just gonna take a bit more. And I would just kind of follow the bag on what they recommend for raising.
What's the name of the stuff that the deer don't like?
Mill organite. MILORGANITE. That's from Milwaukee Organic Nitrogen. All right, now once you have that plant planted, you want to put in a soil ring kind of hold that moisture, especially in real sandy soils. Clay soils is not that critical. But you want to hold that moisture in just around where that root ball is, because that's where the water needs to go. It doesn't need to go way out here, because that's what you're trying to keep alive. Water it well. You want to kind of remove air pockets. You know, if you're planting large plants, the way I used to do it, I would run a slow hose where I'm backfilling and take a shovel and turn the handle down and just kind of work it in and out. That gets rid of those air pockets that might be in there. We generally don't recommend staking trees unless you have to. And if you have to, don't leave it on there more than about 6 months. Because the moving of a tree is what strengthens the bark. Kind of like when we build our muscles up, you know, we break it down and build it back up. Well, the tree does the same thing. As it moves, it breaks the lignin vascular system in there, and it causes it to build up stronger and stronger. So you want a tree that kind of moves. Now, as far as irrigating, again, with a newly planted shrub, you want to water right where that root ball is. And one of the problems I see with a lot of plants, people try to irrigate new plants with an irrigation system. You know, if you have an irrigation system that runs 5 minutes, it's not going to put out enough water. You need to really soak that little root ball down. Sandy soils, maybe 2-3 times a week, depending on how dry it is. Clay soils, maybe once a week. You know, if you have larger trees, everybody, you see those bags that they put around the trunk of a tree? Those are called tree gators. You got small holes in there that the water just kind of oozes out of. So that's another way and they make like big donuts too that you can put around. There's all different kinds of tree gators that you can use. Let's just kind of skip bare root plants. All right, this is something that I did just to kind of show you real quick. Preparing a bed. This was compost that came out of the Area County landfill, and they sell it up there $20 a ton. I had fairly sandy, rich soil to begin with, so I didn't need a whole lot. But that's the pile I started with, and I shoveled that entire. I was a much younger man then. Guess I'm so old. Those 2 shovels right there, I moved that entire pile. But what you're going to do is just put a small, thin layer on top, you know, 3 or 4 inches. Till that in as deep as you can get it, smooth it out, put another 3 or 4 inches on top, till that in, smooth it out until you have, you know, at least about 2 foot of a well-drained soil. And that gives you time to remove, you know, anything that was buried in there, any beer bottles, whiskey bottles, bones. You might find Jimmy Hoffa. And that's just working that compost into the soil. And that's kind of what the bed looks like after it's been done. Even out in natural areas, adding soil to kind of build those soils up is going to be beneficial for the plants that you're going to plant. You got the plant. Again, you want good healthy plants, and look at that spacing. How wide are they going to grow? How tall are they going to grow? You don't want to put them real close together because they're going to grow into each other and you're just going to have a mess. So you want to make sure that you have good spacing between those plants. So again, when they do grow up, they're not holding hands. Again, make sure you got a nice healthy plant. Dig that hole 3 to 5 times as wide as that root ball is. And again, no deeper. And that's the hole, no deeper. I have real sandy soil, so I didn't need to go quite that wide. When you take the plant out of the container, you want to break up that root system, especially if it's a pot-bound plant, because those roots will start circling, and that will choke that plant over time. So you want to run a shovel or a knife through 3 or 4 different spots around that plant to break up those circling roots. And then again, you want that where those first roots are flaring out to be sitting right at ground level. Then you come in and you make your soil ring around the outside, and you just start watering, and hopefully you have success. The other thing you want to look at with foundation plants, know that width and don't plant it too close to that house. Because if everybody's seen those plants that are planted too close and they've got the mohawk in the back, in the nice here, you've got it. So know, I said that a lot of times, haven't I? Know the size of that plant when it's mature and plant them accordingly. And then you can come in with mulch. Now, one thing, I haven't pulled that back yet, but one of the things that we also do not recommend is an organic mulch right up next to the foundation. It creates an avenue for termites. So you want to leave about a 6-8 inch gap. You put rocks around there or stone or something. You don't want to put that mulch right up next to that foundation. And that, with those plants right there, they're still far enough away from that structure where I can walk back behind them without any problem. But if you look at them from the front, you really can't tell. Poorly drained soils, again, we're looking at 2 feet, so you may be coming up on a raised mound. Now, one thing you can also try, I've done this a few times, but you can create what's called a pedestal. You can dig a nice deep hole, but you leave a seat or a pedestal right in the middle of that hole. And you set the plant on that, and then you put all your backfill down, so that way the water hopefully goes down around that pedestal and that root system has a chance to dry out. Now, if you ever get to the point where you have to put corrugated plastic pipes with the sump pump to pump the water out,
Oh my gosh.
it may be time to
Move.
move. Or try a different hobby. All right. Any questions on that? On plants? We'll talk. We've got like 15 minutes, so we'll try to cover it. Yes, sir.
These plastic or mats to keep weeds out, are they good or not good?
The question was the landscape cloth to put on top. I don't recommend plastic. They got better stuff now with the landscape cloth. If it is a sandy soil, landscape cloth is fine. I don't have a problem with it. You just want to make sure it's not right up against the plant itself. You'll leave a little gap. If it is a heavy clay soil that's not draining well, I would not put landscape cloth, because you want evaporation to happen, and that's going to hinder that. Let me get her for a second.
What can you say about potted plants?
What about potted plants?
What, do you have to be careful not to overwater because the roots would stay wet all the time? Is that a big concern? The size of the pot compared to the ball of the plant?
If you're going to put plants in, that is a viable option. If you have a very poorly drained soil, just put your plants in pots. Or if you have some type of a soil problem. My vegetable garden, my entire vegetable garden is in 25-gallon pots. I have 60 25-gallon pots. I grow all my vegetables in those pots. I got one little emitter that sits in one, that sits in each one, and it waters each pot individually. It's all hooked up to a timer. When you are filling a pot with potting soil, you want to fill the entire pot. Because we have probably been taught, or through folklore, that you put rock or something in the bottom. That does not help with drainage. That hinders drainage. When I used to build golf courses, we used that to create a perched water table. Before we laid our seedbed mix, we would put a 2-inch layer of gravel, and then our pea gravel, and then put the seedbed on top of that. And remember what I said about a stratified soil? Whenever you go from one texture to another, the water will not go into that underlying soil until that top one is totally saturated. So the golf courses, you know, we had 2 feet of a seedbed mix, and then we had that layer of gravel, and as the water is going through that seedbed, it hits that interface from the soil to the gravel, and it would stop, and it would create a little perched water table. And that's what you're doing in a pot. So you don't want to do that. Of course, you want to make sure you have holes in the bottom. Now, as far as watering, it really kind of depends on where it's sitting in the landscape, how much wind it gets, how much sun it gets, what type of plant it is. The best way to really tell is to stick your finger down in there and feel if it feels moist. It's got plenty of water. And it's going to vary. I can't tell you exactly how often it's going to take. The other thing I will mention, and this is a true story. I was out, this is years ago, back in the mid-90s. Nice lady lived in Waukesha. She called me up. She had planted azaleas a couple years ago, and they were still about that big. They weren't growing. And I just happened to be going by there, so I thought, let me stop in and take a look. So I got to looking at these things, and there was mulch underneath, and, you know, they were only about that big. They've been planted for 3 years, you know. I have what's called soil probe. It's this long tube that you stick down in the soil, so you can see what the soil's like underneath. And I put it next to that plant, and I kept hitting something hard. Then I reached down and I moved that mulch, and I popped the whole pot and all. A plastic pot. She planted the plastic pot and everything. So, before you plant a plant, if it's in a plastic pot, take it out of the pot first. We took them out of the pot, replanted them, and they grew like crazy after that. Any other questions before we move on to turf? Yes, sir.
Real quick, when you talk about putting down a barrier for weeds,
Uh-huh.
how far do you judge out from like a
I
shrub?
would go out to the drip line of the shrub.
Okay,
Because that's where all your feeder roots are gonna be up underneath there.
so basically, widest part of the shrub that's, okay.
I used to always fertilize at the drip line.
Yeah, spread it out underneath, out to the drip line.
Yeah, so it's out away from the stem of the plant and in the drip line.
Just make sure you spread out.
Yeah, I got it.
Anything else? All right, turf grass, real quick. Let's just kind of go through some of the management parts. Well, let me start with this. There are 4 grasses that we grow here for turfs. We have Bermuda grass, which is what you will see on all the sports fields. Football field, baseball field, golf courses. We have St. Augustine. Sometimes people will call it Charleston grass. We have centipede, which I could talk to the good Lord, I'd say just wipe out centipede. And we have zoysia, Z-O-Y-S-I-A, which is the new up and coming grass, is what everybody's kind of going to. It's really good stuff. Those are the 4 grasses that we grow here.
Isn't the centipede the most durable?
Depending on where it's growing. If it's growing in a real wet soil that does not drain well, it's probably not. You got to take centipede for what centipede is. Centipede was, I don't want to say developed, but was grown in China after World War II because they needed something to cover the graves to keep the soil from washing away. And it had to be something that could handle real droughty conditions, no fertilizer, no mowing. Of course, you know, they probably had a lot of graves to cover. That's where centipede came from, and that's why you have to kind of take centipede for what it is. It's not a real pretty grass. I tell people when centipede is as ugly as it can look, it's happy. But the problem that we have, Robert, is, you know, we have people who move down here that are used to fescues and the bluegrasses and the ryegrass, and they want that real dark green, thick, lush grass. That's not centipede. So yeah, if you treat centipede right, it is very durable. If you don't, if you go out there and fertilize it 5 times a year and you get it real thick, guess what? It's gonna die. Yes, sir.
Is that pretty much what people call field grass around here? What is field grass?
More than likely what I would think field grass would be Bermuda grass. Oh, common wild Bermuda grass. We would call it wire grass. Yes, ma'am.
Which is your favorite
Uh,
for this area with clay soil?
right now, and again, it depends on the situation that it's growing in. I'm not sure I have a particular favorite, to be honest with you. I like the zoysia grasses. There are some new varieties that are coming out that are really nice, and they can withstand quite a bit so far.
In hearing different types of grass different people are using, I kind of threw down a mix of those seeds. I figured whatever will do well in the area is going to stick around and the other stuff's going to die off.
Well, the problem with that, if you have a seed, there is a seeded Bermuda grass, but it is a common Bermuda grass. It's not one of the hybrids. So it's not going to look like a football field or a baseball field. You can't get centipede seed. The centipede is really hard to get up from seed. And there are a couple of zoysia grass varieties. Compadre is one, and then there's another one too. But people are having a tough time getting lawns established from that. So, you know, if you've got the seed, it's probably not going to be a real fine textured, depending on what you're looking for. You know, if you want it to look like Augusta in April, from seed, you're probably not gonna get that. Any other questions? I was gonna say something.
So what is the best grass from seed?
Oh, I know what I was gonna say. There is no San Augustine to begin with, so you can scratch that off if you want to see. If you have, and again, it kind of depends on what you want. If you have full sun, I would probably say one of the Bermuda grasses, the improved Bermuda grass varieties is probably the best from seed. But there's a lot of people who just can't stand Bermuda grass. They think it's a weed. And again, the zoysia grasses, if you can get it up, like I have not seen many people successfully get zoysia grass up from seed. So, you know, whether that's going to work. You know, really the best way if you want to get along and you don't have a very large area is to sod it. Price-wise, Bermuda grass and centipede are going to be your cheapest sod. Most summers it's going to run anywhere between $80 to $110 a pallet, and a pallet covers 500 square feet, kind of standard in the industry. San Augustine and zoysia is going to cost you somewhere between probably $190 and $220 a pallet. Now, you can also plug. You know, if you don't want to buy, if you have 1,000 square feet, you can buy one pallet of 500 square feet, cut those into plugs and make it go farther. And you can buy zoysia grass plugs, so.
Which of these grasses is likely to grow under an oak tree?
None of them. Now, as far as shade, shade and trees is real simple. If you want a nice, thick stand of grass, cut all your trees down and grow grass. If you like your trees, don't worry about the grass. 12 years of college right there. The way, let me go through it. The way these kind of break out shade-wise, Bermuda grass needs full sun all day long. It needs 10 to 12 hours of full sun. And now remember, if you've got Bermuda grass and you put a small tree in the yard, guess what that small tree turns into? A big tree. Over time, you're going to start losing it underneath. Centipede really needs about 6 hours minimum, does better at 8. San Augustine, minimum 4, but that's really pushing it. It's going to be thin. It really needs about 6. Now all these will grow in full sun, without any problem. Zoysia grass, there are some varieties that will go down to about 4 hours as well, maybe even 2. I've got one called Xeon in my backyard, and there's one spot where I get maybe 2-3 hours of full sun. It is thin, but it's still somewhat acceptable. I'd say probably a 5 or 6 on a 1 to 10 scale rating. So some of these zoysia grasses are really handling the shade well, but when you're right up underneath the tree, not only is it a shade problem, but that tree is taking so many resources out of that soil. And if you're putting fertilizer down on that grass, and if you're putting weed killers down on that grass, that's affecting the tree. So I would like to just see you naturalize under the tree. Let's grow grass where we can grow grass, and let the tree grow where a tree wants to grow. Make sense?
Yeah.
Now if you want to come in here and sod it every couple of years, I can sell that. Yes, sir.
Outside of ivies, 'cause like I said, I don't like ivies, plus they can grow up on the tree and damage the tree. What are some other things you could plant around or near the tree that would be aesthetically pleasing?
Well, there's mondo grasses, there's liriopes, there's some shade-loving plants that you can plant. But one thing you might want to consider doing, instead of digging into the ground and affecting that root system, is just grow them in pots. Just place pots up underneath the tree. You know, they make decorative pots that you can use. That way you're not hurting the tree. The plant's got all the soil that it needs. Compromise. You know, let's work with the tree. Yes, ma'am.
What would you recommend a good weed killer for lawns?
Okay, well, let's go ahead and go through that real quick. I know we're running short of time, and that's going to be a good question. All right, now, as far as weeds in lawns, there are 2 ways of controlling weeds. We can use a pre-emergent herbicide, or we can use a post-emergent herbicide. A pre-emergent herbicide is applied before the weed seed germinates. A post-emergent herbicide is only gonna work on annual weeds, not gonna work on perennial weeds, like the dollar weed, or the Florida betony, or sedges. A post-emergent herbicide is, I see weed, I spray weed, hopefully weed dies. Usually it doesn't, but hopefully weed dies. All right, now if you want to go on a pre-emergent herbicide program, year-round, it takes 4 applications. February and May, that's going to control your summer annuals. Goosegrass, crabgrass, sandspurs, things like that. You can put another application out in September and another one in December. That should give you year-long pre-emergent control. And there are 4 common ones that you're going to find, although there's a whole lot of other ones. But for homeowners, the 4 common ones you're going to find, Scott puts one out called Halts, Halts. You also have, I'm not sure who the manufacturer is, but you also have one called Crab X. Some of you have probably seen that. You also have one called Dimension. And you have one called Barricade. Those are the 4 common pre-emergent herbicides. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
As far as not killing off your germinating new grass seed, how far from planting new grass seed?
I don't recommend any weed control for at least 1 year, whether you're seeding or whether you're sodding on a new lawn. That gives it a chance to root in, and gives you a chance to see what kind of a weed problem that you have. All right, any questions on pre-emergent herbicides? Post-emergent herbicides. They're broken down into 3 different categories. We have those that control broadleaf weeds, and those are usually what we call broadleaf weed killers, or 3-way mixes. It's a mixture of 2,4-D, MCPP, and dicamba. And that you can just spray on the top. There's usually not a problem with turf until it gets, well, two times. One, when it's starting to green up. And the other when temperatures are above 85 degrees. Be real careful then, because they can burn up some of these grasses. The other post-emergent herbicide are those that control grassy weeds. There's not a lot of those available to homeowners now. Especially in St. Augustine, there's really nothing. Bermuda grass, Georgia grass, there's a couple. So if you have a real bad annual grass problem, you're probably better off at least, well, I'll say all year long for grassy weeds, we're going with the pre-emergent program. Probably the biggest grassy weed program that you're seeing now is annual bluegrass, or poana. That grassy weed stuff puts on the white seed heads now, it's annual bluegrass. Now the other weed are sedges, nutgrass, or nutgrass. And the way you can tell the difference between a nutgrass and a regular grass, if you look at the stem of nutgrass, it is triangular. It has 3 sides, whereas grasses are round. So if you get on the stems, you get 3 sides, and usually the leaves are trifoliate, so there's 3 leaves planted on there. There are 2 herbicides that will work on sedges. There's one called Image, and there's one called Sedge Hammer. Proper name. That's kind of it on. Now the other question, if anybody has, anybody got a question on weed and feeds? You know what a weed and feed is? Weed and feed's a herbicide and a fertilizer mixed together. A couple of things you need to know about weed and feeds if you have that dark moment where you might want to use one. You can get weed and feeds that have both a pre-emergent herbicide in it, and you can get those that have a post-emergent herbicide. So the first thing you have to determine with that particular product, does it have a pre-emergent herbicide or does it have a post-emergent herbicide? If I'm putting down a weed and feed for pre-emergent and it's got a post-emergent herbicide, it's not going to do a thing for you. And vice versa. If you have existing weeds and you're putting a weed and feed to control and it's got a pre-emergent herbicide, it's not going to do anything for those weeds. So that's the first thing you have to determine. The second thing is timing. Remember, if we're going to go with a pre-emergent program, when is our first application? February. Do we need to be putting fertilizer in February? No. So we're just wasting that fertilizer. Now, in May, you might be able to get away with it. And the same thing with September. September, you may be able to get away with it. But in December, we don't need to fertilize, so you don't need it. Now, with those two May and September where you might be able to get by with the weed and feed, a lot of these weed and feeds have a lot of nitrogen in them, which is not good on centipede. And you have to put it out at the rate of for the herbicide. If you don't get enough herbicide out there, it's not going to work. So you may be juicing up your yard a little bit with too much nitrogen. So there's just a lot of things you've got to kind of calculate with the weed and feeds. That's what we don't recommend. Fertilizer, we need to fertilize. We got a weed problem, we got a weed problem. And post-emergent really it depends on the grass you have and the weeds you have. You know, if you got a specific problem that you can't figure out, just call me and we'll work through it.
Sometimes when you've got a backyard that's more weed than grass, is it better to just maybe take a rototiller to the thing and put down some
Yeah, well,
really strong weed killer when you do it?
you're getting into what we call a renovation. And what I look at when I go into a yard that needs renovating, if there is 50% or more of that yard in grass, I can probably get that back in one growing season. If there is less than 50% grass in that yard, you pretty much start over. And that's where you come in and just spray something like Roundup or Finale and kill everything. Get your seed bed right, and then plant grass where grass is going to grow, not under the trees.
I should have written it down, but the weed killer that I was using was 41% glycol.
Glyphosate.
Yeah,
That's right.
same stuff.
That's
Yeah, I
right.
got the farm 3-gallon thing of it.
Generally with Roundup, if you want to kill everything, you're looking at about an 8 to a 10% solution.
Do any of these pre-emergence, post-emergence, take care of like mole, crickets, or whatever?
These are herbicides, these are not
Oh,
insecticides.
okay.
That's another.
Another subject, okay.
Yes.
I know we haven't gotten to poisons and so forth, but I have, like St. Augustine, kind of, something is eating almost in a perfect circle. Some kind of
Is it eating or is it dying?
dying.
You ever see mushrooms?
Yes.
That is probably a fairy ring.
A fairy ring?
Fairy ring.
And what can I do about it?
Fairy rings are kind of difficult to control. Probably the best thing to do is aerify. It is a basidiomycete fungi, which is a mushroom type fungi, and that mycelia right there in that area just packs in so tight that the grass can't get any water. So aerifying around that ring will help. There really are no fungicides that are that effective on fairy ring. It's just more of a cultural thing. Adding organic matter into that soil after you aerify will help as well. And the way it got its name way back whenever they first came up with this stuff. They saw these rings and they thought it was fairies at night that was coming down. And they grow out. I saw a picture of one over in England. They took it from a helicopter. It was almost a mile wide.
Wow.
You can see the whole ring. That's kind of cool.
What about moss?
Moss on the
I got a
soil.
couple of spots of moss. I aerated last year. I drug, my.
Is it shady in that area or is it full sun?
Yeah, well, you live in Georgetown, you get shade. That's all there's to that. But, I think I got Bermuda grass, and it, with a little bit of help last year, some fertilizer and aeration, it started to grow over this moss, but the moss is, will that break up? That answers my question, because there's starting to get grass there.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The question is moss. Moss generally grows in a little more acidic soils, so
Yeah,
sometimes
that's
adding
what-
a little lime might
Yeah,
help. But what you have to do with moss is get the grass to grow in that area so it'll cover the moss, and the moss can't grow. So you need to determine why that grass isn't growing.
I did pH test, and I did put,
What was, do you remember what the pH was?
it was just below 7, it was around 6. But then, okay, back in the old days, all right, I would sprinkle lime any place that I had moss, because I know that the lime was not friendly to the moss because it would change the pH. And the grass is starting to grow there, and I think grass is probably the way to get rid of the moss, but I was just, is
Yeah,
there a way to accelerate that
a little bit
process?
of lime, I wouldn't add too much lime, because you don't want to get that pH way too high.
No, I got all these trees around anyway, so.
But, if it's Bermuda grass and you have any shade at all, it could be more of a shade Bermuda grass problem than it is. Because the moss will grow everywhere. And they do make mossicides that will kill the moss, but if you don't change conditions, it'll come right back.
Another odd thing about living in town is that the shade shifts with the season. The sun comes up straight over the bay across from my house in the wintertime, but now it's, it's a half mile up the bay. And there's all houses in the way.
There are seasonal changes.
Yeah.
Part of it. Am I out of time?
I think so.
Okay, Robert, any more questions?
Thank you.
Gary, thank you.